My name is Bill Schoolman, and I am an angry taxpayer, a very angry taxpayer. And I have a business close by here in Bohemia, Classic Coach, big blue and white buses. Maybe some of you have seen it. And last year I bought another company called Hampton Luxury Liner that goes from New York City to the Hamptons, goes from New York City up to Woodbury Common, and New York City down to Atlantic City. So I'm in the motor coach business, and I've lived in Suffolk County almost all my life. And I've been in business since 1976, and it's been extremely frustrating over those years to do business in the state of New York. And in 2009, they passed this horrible tax called the MTA payroll tax. And for me, it was the last straw. Perhaps some of you remember that movie Network, where that guy leaned out the window and he got up and he said, "I'm sick and tired and I'm not going to take it anymore." That's me. So tonight, I'm going to educate you about the evil empire. The evil empire is the MTA, and it screws over Long Islanders more so than any other geographical area. And they passed this terrible tax called the MTA payroll tax, which is not the largest tax we pay, but it's a very important tax because it is the symbol of exactly what's wrong with going on both in New York State and on a federal basis where government is in our pocket. So what we're going to talk about tonight is getting government out of our pocket. I'd like to first explain the handout. I've done about 60 of these talks. In fact, there's a couple faces out here in the audience who have seen me do this before. Tonight it'll be a little bit different because there's some other news to report to you. So this first page is called the solicitation, and I would love to go to any group that you could think of that may want to hear this message. My job is to educate people about the fiscal irresponsibility of the MTA and why this tax was just an absolutely dumb tax and we've got to get rid of it. Anyway, so that's the first page. It's called the solicitation, and I'll go over, there's a couple of quotes in there that are pretty interesting. And then there's a call for action on the next couple pages, which kind of summarizes a lot of the things I'm going to cover. And then there's the details of what was a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to refer to a couple of those slides. But you have this as a reference document, and so when we get to it, I'll call your attention to what page I'm on, because there's some details there you want to follow it along when I go over the examples of the fiscal irresponsibility. Then at the back of the presentation is a page that looks like this. It's in color. And what I'm hoping for is that I'll motivate some of you to come to a fundraiser to support this lawsuit. Now, I'm a very motivated entrepreneur. I'll just give you one drop of background. I have mortgaged my house 12 times for my business, 12 times. And at one time, I actually had a mortgage at 23, a third mortgage on my house at 23%. Now, why am I telling you that? Because can you imagine how angry it would make anyone who took those kinds of risks to preserve his business to have to pay a stupid tax, which it's not the biggest tax I have to pay, but it's the dumbest. And it goes to support a money pit, an organization called the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which has a 45-year history of complete fiscal irresponsibility And lately, primarily because of all the cutbacks they've made to the Long Island Railroad, Long Island Bus, and other cuts they've made, that on top of this MTA payroll, which was put upon us in 2009, that makes me crazy. And I actually borrowed the money to do this lawsuit. So what I'm hoping for is that some of you will support this effort, and there's nothing in it for me on a personal basis other than to leave this world in a better place. For my kids that are taking over the business, and for my grandchildren, whatever. New York State is the most difficult state in the United States, including California, to do business in. If you're in business and you have to deal with the New York State Department of Labor, the Division of Human Rights, workman's comp, taxation and finance, they are nightmares. And the general attitude in Albany is screw the taxpayer. And that's why, and you know, you guys can all get involved supporting candidates. But the reality is that some candidates, when they go to run for election, what do? They make you promises that they never keep. How many politicians have you heard say, vote for me, I'm going to reduce your taxes? And yet, every single year, and never like in the last 5 years, our taxes in New York State have gone up drastically. And this MTA, now, you know, there's lots of taxes that make us nuts. There's the pension tsunami that Newsday had a pretty good article on yesterday, although, you know, Newsday's not a great reference for anything. But the pension tsunami, that's gonna drive us all crazy. All these municipalities have to chip in so much money. Then there's real estate taxes, school taxes, this tax, that tax. There's 1,100 authorities in the state of New York. 1,100 authorities with combined total debts of $214 billion. And who do you think's paying for that? You and I. Because the interest rate on all their bonds, with all that debt, roughly at 5%, is about a little over $10 billion a year that users have to pay. 1,100 authorities, and the MTA is the worst. You're familiar, there's the MTA, the Port Authority, there's a Turnpike Authority, a Dormitory Authority. So there's all kinds of authorities. And we have the Suffolk County Water Authority. And authorities are a place where people can print money. They can print their own money because they can create their own debt. They can float a bond to cover operating expenses, yet they're supposed to be self-sufficient. One of the things we're going to talk about that's really going to make you angry, because it's just hard to imagine that it won't. Every authority in the state of New York, which is owned by you and I, the taxpayers, they are separate government entities. They have the power to raise revenues, create debt, and they operate basically as shadow governments, answerable essentially to nobody. The MTA, the biggest one, let's just cover who they are. Probably most of you are familiar with it. The MTA owns, it's supposed to be a regional transportation system. They control all the bridges and tunnels that are intra-state, within the state. So that's the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, the Midtown Tunnel, the Throgs Neck Bridge, Triborough Bridge, Whitestone Bridge, control all the bridges. Battery Tunnel, I mentioned that. They control the New York City subway system, the New York City bus system. They operate Long Island Bus. They own the Long Island Railroad and Metro North. Collectively, they've spent, on the average in the last 2 years, $13.8 billion. A lot of people don't know that. And their financial statements are separate from the state of New York. So, you know, all these cutbacks with the Long Island Railroad, cut in service, they did make other cuts in some other places, but nobody's been affected by it more than Long Islanders. And I don't know how many people notice, but every time we have to leave Long Island, we have to pay homage to the MTA. Has anybody noticed that the bridges and tunnels are now $13 round trip to leave Long Island? It's $6.50 each way. Used to be $5.50. Yet, if you were to take the Tappan Zee Bridge, it's $5 round trip. And if you took the George Washington Bridge, which is larger than any of these other bridges, it's $4 round trip. So some light bulbs ought to go off. Like, why is it that those bridges and tunnels are $13, yet the others are $4 or $5? Answer: because those are the ones that are owned by the MTA. And they are this impossible money pit that is always running out of money. They are the most fiscally irresponsible corporate organization in the United States. Nobody compares to it. And I'm going to go over chapter and verse and show you where they burn. In fact, here's my favorite expression. Nobody burns taxpayer dollars better than the MTA. It is an absolute true statement. Now, so I've got this fundraiser, and Steve Levy is going to be our keynote speaker, because Steve Levy, as the executive for Suffolk County, is the only one who got it right when it came to all these lawsuits. So it's December of 2009, and I go out and I borrowed the money, and I started a lawsuit against the MTA, the governor, and the legislature. December 14th, 2009. Subsequent to me doing that, 10 municipalities, it's now 10, plus one school district, the William Floyd School District, has copied our lawsuit word for word. So that's what's covered on this first page here. It's now 10 municipalities. Copied it word for word, started their own lawsuit. Levy got it right, and he said municipalities should not be doing this lawsuit. And then he said Schoolman's lawsuit covers all taxpayers. So Huntington did it with, I think it was Babylon. Brookhaven did it with Smithtown, I think it was. First one, Southampton did it with Southold. So they're all over the place. And then people from upstate started to do it. The MTA covers what's called the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation District. That's 12 counties. Those 12 counties are Rockland, Orange, Putnam, Westchester, and Dutchess, which is north of New York City, the 5 boroughs of New York City, and then Nassau and Suffolk County. That's 12 counties. Nobody else is paying the MTA payroll tax. So when all these lawsuits started, the first thing the MTA did was they hired one of the most expensive law firms in New York City called Nixon Peabody. Any attorneys in the room? Good. One. Nixon Peabody is well known. They get about $600 to $800 an hour. All of those expenses you and I are paying for. So we're paying for a law firm so that to defend an unconstitutional tax, the first thing Nixon Peabody did was make a motion to send Huntington's lawsuit up to Albany County, where nobody pays the tax. We can't even get a jury of our peers. How could anybody react to this evil tax if you're not paying it? So anyway, Huntington, that's why municipalities don't belong in the lawsuit. They did a lousy job of defending it. They lost, and their lawsuit has been sent up to Albany. So you got all these lawsuits all over the place. So it was a compliment to us that everybody copied it, but strategically it was terrible. Because what they should have done, but that's what politicians do. Politicians, and the worst was Mangano. And I don't care, you know, I saw him at a meeting. I actually got up and told him, you need to cancel your lawsuit. It's bad for all taxpayers. He said, we'll study that. And he gave me some of his business card. You know, Mangano got up. Look at Nassau County. I mean, doesn't he have enough to worry about? You know, they're practically bankrupt as compared to Suffolk. So he gets up and he makes his own lawsuit, and then he calls for the chairman of the MTA to get fired. And then at the same time, he's negotiating with the MTA, trying to get Long Island Bus back. I mean, do you think he really has the taxpayers' best interests at heart? The problem here is no one in Albany supports taxpayers. That's what the problem is. Special interest groups get it all. And hopefully, that's one of the reasons why this MTA payroll tax is a very important struggle. So I gave you this flyer on the fundraiser, and it's going to be, all of the money that is raised will be used for legal fees, because this thing's going to go on for a while. And I am of single purpose to see this thing through to the end. Like I said, I borrowed the money to start it, and now there's this group called Tax Relief Now, where this is a committee. I have two co-chairs, Jack Colker, who's a big name in construction in Nassau and Suffolk, and Joe Campolo, who is the author of the lawsuit. So when you get a chance, look at the flyer on the back, and if anybody can go, it would be greatly appreciated. And last, I put a thing in there. It's not that we're nonpartisan, but Levy got it right. Steve Levy is the only one who clearly took a position that municipalities do not belong in that fight. So that's what the handout is. So now what I'd like to cover with you is, let's take a look at a slide. Let's take a look at the front cover here. Looks like this, it's in color. Just want to explain the title there. It says, Fighting the MTA Payroll Tax. I think of the MTA as a $56 billion octopus without a brain. How many people remember the World Cup last year? Everybody watch those games, anyone? You remember the octopus Paul? I'm seeing an affirmative over here. So they had this octopus in Germany. His name was Paul. And they put food in his, whatever that container was that he was in. And he picked almost all the matches correctly. Do not confuse Paul with Bloaty, the octopus of the MTA, which is the $56 billion octopus that has no brain. Because that's what the MTA is. It's something that grabs everything in sight, every business possible, does none of them well, so I call it the $56 billion octopus. Try to imagine they have $56 billion of assets. So that's why I call them the $56 billion octopus with no brain. They grab everything. And then it says, nobody burns taxpayer dollars better than the MTA. Take a look at that next page there. I just want to give you the flavor. And Tax Relief Now is focused on the MTA struggle for the following reasons. There are other taxes that drive us crazy. But let me explain to you why I think this is where you have to pick your fights. You got to pick where you want to start a battle. And there's essentially 6 reasons why I picked the MTA. Because we all need tax relief. First reason. Number 1, it's unconstitutional. I'll explain that in a few minutes. It violates this law, the way it was passed, violates 5 sections of the New York State Constitution and 1 section of the Public Authorities Law. And one of the most outrageous things is that you and I collectively, even though an authority is supposed to be by law self-sufficient, you and I contribute Now we contribute $9.5 billion in hidden little taxes and subsidies to the MTA. I'm going to show you that in detail. So, the first reason is it's unconstitutional and it's the ideal place to start the battle of getting government out of our pockets. So whether you have a business or not, you're paying that MTA payroll tax, and you pay it in all kinds of strange ways. A little tiny line item on your cell phone bill. You pay a lot when it comes to fuel taxes. You pay it when you do a mortgage, your house phone. Sales tax has a little entry. Before they did the mobility tax, there were 8 different taxes and subsidies that we all contributed. Then they came out with this payroll tax that employers have to pay. But the reality is, they call it a payroll tax, but it's a tax against employees. So whether you're the owner of the business or an employee, you're hurt from it. Because if your employer has to pay this ridiculous tax, that means there's benefits that he can't be giving to you. So everybody suffers over this. So it's a tax on employees. That's exactly what it is, and that's why a lot of people say it's a job killer. The second reason that I'd like to see the MTA tax canceled, of all things. The New York metropolitan region needs a very strong regional transportation system, a robust transportation system. The MTA is not robust. It is weak, it is fiscally irresponsible, and it is highly inefficient. So, I mean, the perfect example is paying $13 to cross the Frog's Neck Bridge. If the MTA was run properly, we would not be paying for those bridges and tunnels. In fact, I did a calculation. I took the cost of the bridges and tunnels. Some of them are 70 years old. I brought it forward by an inflation factor. And I figured out how much they would cost today if they were built today based on that cost of inflation. You and I pay for those bridges and tunnels every 4.7 years. That's amazing. So, you know, I don't know if you remember or not, but there was a toll last time I saw one removed on the Southern State Parkway. And eventually they took it down because whatever went to pay for the Southern State, that was used up. Well, the same should be true for all these other bridges and tunnels. And every time you install a toll, you are interfering with someone's personal mobility. So if you lived in Westchester and you wanted to work on Long Island, you're going to incur a minimum of a $13 a day, 5 days a week cost to get from Westchester to Long Island, or Long Island into New York City. Or you're going to have to pay outrageously high fees to the Long Island Railroad. And it's very overpriced. Another reason why I think it's important to focus on the MTA is the MTA is essentially a failed business model. The authority concept doesn't work. It allows for too much patronage and fiscal irresponsibility. It's a bottomless pit, money pit. Think of how the MTA payroll tax was intended to bring in $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion. It actually brought in about 1.3. What if that money had been used for job growth during the recession? That really would have been a good thing. And the last reason, and this is the big one, if we can't win on this issue, you'll never win on the others. Because the only way we can get reform is when Albany respects us as taxpayers. Taxpayers need a seat at the table in Albany. The state budget $138 billion. The deficit is around $9.5 billion. The MTA is 1/10 the size. 200,000 employees for the state of New York. The MTA has 70,000 employees. New York State spends scheduled to spend about $138 billion. The MTA, 13.8. I mean, who would have ever thought? By the way, anybody who hasn't, if you've already heard the answer, don't answer. Just to tell you where this waste goes, take a guess at what the top paid mechanic for the Long Island Railroad, part of the MTA's salary structure, what do you think they made in 2007, including overtime? Anybody have an educated guess who hasn't heard this program before? $283,000. It's a lot of money, right? And when he retires, he gets a $10,000 a month pension. How about the top paid conductor for the Long Island Railroad? $241,000 with overtime. Think about it. I'm not making that kind of money. Most people on Long Island aren't. But he only got a $9,700 a month pension. Crazy. So we're going to get into a lot of that stuff in a second. What's important is we got to get this country back to its roots, which is no taxation without representation. That's a basic principle. And that principle is violated with any money that we pay to the MTA. And yet it's underneath the radar. So our job is to educate people of what's going on and force Albany to restructure the MTA, which would be actually pretty simple to do. So that's what this slide explains. Explains why we've decided it's such an important priority. So I started the lawsuit in 2009. 5 violations of the New York State Constitution, 1 violation of the Public Authorities Law. Just to give you an idea how crazy things are, what you're going to see in a couple slides is that you and I, all taxpayers staying in New York, contribute to the MTA $9.5 billion in subsidies and taxes above the service fees for riding the subway, riding the railroad, or the bridges and tunnels. Think of it, $9.5 billion. The law says they're supposed to be self-sufficient. It's a public authority. New York State taxpayers are not supposed to pay the debts of an authority, and they're not supposed to subsidize an authority. Yet this has been going on for 45 years. And we have 2 groups, one on the Assembly side, one on the Senate side, that is supposed to correct this situation, supposed to monitor them, oversight committees. People up in Albany get paid $10,000 extra a year if they're a chairman of a committee. And yet there's never been any serious committee meetings ever on the MTA and the abuses of the MTA. The sad thing is, and this tax was completely unnecessary if the MTA was managed properly, which it isn't. And it's impossible to get this thing legislatively repealed. And here's why. A repeal of a law requires a 2/3 vote. It passed by 60% in the Assembly, passed by 1 vote in the Senate. And by the way, I was very active in doing this talk when Lee Zeldin ran against Brian Foley. I gave 4 fire and brimstone speeches. It's not so much that it was for Lee Zeldin as much as it was against Brian Foley, and I'm proud of those efforts. And I did the same thing in Port Washington and Manhasset when Craig Johnson and Brian Foley were 2 senators who voted to support the MTA payroll tax. And to me, that was just unforgivable. So, I did the best I could. it will never, within the next, unless you get rid of all the New York City Democrats, it's never going to be repealed by the Assembly. So, but one of the things that we would like is for there to be a one-house bill of at least all the Republicans taking a stand and saying, it's time to get rid of this tax. What I'd like you to do now is, I want to just cover some of the most outrageous abuses. And by the way, I have a website. It's nystaxreliefnow.org and another website, and they're all mentioned in this handout. MTA taxpayer abuse. When my website is finished, it'll be the definitive source on the 45-year history of all the fiscal irresponsibility of the MTA. And the stories go on and on and on and on. So take a look at page 4 of the handout. It looks at the top, it says, historical highlights of the fiscal irresponsibility of the MTA. Does everybody have that?
Show it to the camera.
What's that?
You show it to the camera.
Oh, okay. Oh, there you go. Very good point. It's fine. All right, so they got this new chairman. His name is Jay Walder, and he claims he's cutting expenses. He's not cutting expenses. He cuts service. He did nothing to cut the waste. They still have their $56 billion of assets. They have real estate holdings that are unbelievable. They're involved in lots of other business opportunities. So I'm just going to cover some of the highlights, but there's much more there. So if you've read any of the news, all these cutbacks to the Long Island Railroad, it was all over $800 million budget shortfall for the MTA. The MTA is sitting with cash investments totaling $3.7 billion. Of that $3.7 billion, $1.8 billion are unrestricted investments like treasury bills. So rather than those guys liquidating those assets, because they want to keep them, they want their cake and they want to eat it also. That's what this is all about. They think they're royalty. No attempt by Jay Walder to really cut expenses and restructure the MTA, which he could have done. So they got $3.7 billion in liquid investments, which when you read their financial statement, it says, quote, not required for operations. So not only do they have those funds, but they have investment counselors that you and I pay for at very high salaries to maintain those investments. That's absurd. Why didn't Cuomo say to Jay Walder, liquidate those assets? I'm not bringing up anything that anyone else who just goes through the documents couldn't find. So they got $3.7 billion in liquid investments. Their salaries are unbelievable. Right now, their total salaries, out of $13.8 billion in total expenses, $8 billion of it goes to themselves. Their salaries are $8 billion, but their fees that they take in from service is only $4.8 billion, not including the bridges and tunnels. So the Long Island Railroad, New York City subway system, the New York City bus system, Metro North, whatever service fees they charge, that comes to $4.8 billion. But their salaries are $8 billion. Who's ever heard of a business where the salaries exceed the revenues by 66%? That's crazy. And yet, it's got $56 billion in assets and $24 billion in debts. No bank would ever lend the MTA money if it wasn't covered by New York State taxpayers, because they never get paid. Here's one that's been in the news quite a bit. $600 million last year in overtime approved without question, of which 77% of that overtime undocumented. That's unbelievable, isn't it? Can you imagine having a business where people are just taking their own overtime? That's why that guy made $283,000. This one gets me, the next one. Number 2 Broadway. This is just how they think. Their corporate culture is corrupted. They wanted a New World headquarters. This is so pathetic. So they picked a really nice location. Number 2 Broadway. Great. Way downtown, Lower Manhattan. And why'd they pick that? Because if you look to the right, you got a great view of the Hudson River. I mean, these guys are royalty, so they're entitled to fancy offices with a big view, and we should pay for it. And if you want to look at the Statue of Liberty, we're going to look south. And if you want to see the East River, we're going to look to the left. So they're going to build this building, their world headquarters, which they did. It was supposed to cost $140 million to build this world headquarters. That in itself was outrageously high. Guess how much it finally cost you and I, all taxpayers, including the debts, the funding of it? $845 million. It went from $140 million to $845 million. 5 people went to jail over that period of time, because obviously there was a lot of corruption involved. Who paid for that? You and I did. In 2003, they were looking for more fare increases. Same as today. What did it turn out? Well, they had secret bank accounts somewhere else. It was probably the Cayman Islands, where they had close to $500 million just stashed away. Where am I getting this information from? It's available to everyone. I get it from New York State Controller reports. I get it from the Inspector General reports of the MTA. All on the internet. So 2 sets of books. Remember I was telling you about the engineers and the conductors, how high paid they were? So in the middle of the recession, while I'm making cutbacks, your lifestyle is being infringed, everybody's hurting, it's October 2009, the MTA decides that they need a new employee lounge for the conductors and engineers. So they picked a nice location, Grand Central Station. And they went, and Donald Trump used to have a tennis academy there. So they took the property away from Donald Trump. He was paying $4 a foot. People say that real estate was probably worth around $200 a foot. So they take that property away from Donald Trump, and they're going to build an employee lounge. This is going to be some employee lounge, let me tell you. $20 million for the employee lounge. And when they were criticized, what did they say? Oh, don't be worried. $18 million is coming from federal stimulus money. Guess who pays for that? You and I. Then, if that wasn't bad enough in October 2009, in November of 2009, they wanted to build a special dog facility. They had about 60, 70 dogs. These are sentry dogs that smell like drugs and bags and people. Personally, for as long as I've been traveling, I have never seen one of the sentry dogs. Anybody here ever seen one of the sentry dogs? Now, in most canine corps, cops take the dogs home with them. Not at the MTA. They do it better. So they want to build this dog house. So they go out and they buy property in Dutchess County for $1 million. The building that they're going to erect, which is going up now, because they just do whatever they want to do, is another $6 million. So up in Poughkeepsie, when some state senator found out about it, he called it the $7 million doghouse. And that was November 2009. Their staff levels are unbelievable. They're a monopoly. You and I don't have a choice what train system you're going to take. They are legally designated as a monopoly. It's supposed to be run like a business. It's not. Why would a monopoly who doesn't need to advertise, why would a monopoly need 698 people for human resources, 443 for legal, plus they spend money with outside legal services, 444 people in public relations and marketing? That's unbelievable. For a monopoly, Amtrak, as an example, had 16 people, but the MTA has 440. What do you think's really going on there? Patronage. And that's the problem with authorities. It's a license to just give people crazy jobs. 359 in budget and accounting, 166 labor relations, a total of 2,010 employees. I just read about a month, 2 weeks ago, Jay Walder, the CEO, he hired this very famous international consulting firm, McKinsey, where he was a partner. So he hired his friends, gave them a contract to do cost reduction and look for places where employees could be cut. Anyone with a brain could get rid of this waste. But he decided to give McKinsey this big contract. They're entitled to 9% of the savings. It is estimated that they will make $11.7 million on that contract. That's just absolute waste. There were 8,200 employees out of 70,000 making more than 100,000 in 07. Last year, 1 out of 4 Long Island Railroad employees now make more than 100,000. They needed some special shoes for people in the computer department. So for the computer department, they went out and they spent $10,000 for these special shoes that don't conduct electricity. Nobody wore them. How does that happen? How does it? A couple wore them once, but the majority weren't worn by anyone. And you must have read how 97 to 98% of all the retired people from the Long Island Railroad go out on disability, playing golf for free. So when is enough enough? That's what we're all paying for. So when you pay this tax into this money pit, this is where it's going. I just want to cover some of the financial parts that are just amazing. If you take a look at slide 5, total expenses, $13.8 billion, revenues of 6.1, of which 1.3 comes from bridges and tunnels. There's no service performed on a bridge and tunnel. That's just a revenue stream used to fund this money pit. So their service revenues are only $4.8 billion. Salaries, $8 billion. Debts, $28.4. Assets, $56.2. That's why I said they're the octopus without a brain. They grab everything in sight that they can, and then when they get a hold of it, they don't know what to do with it. So, if you look on slide 6, you'll see where that $9.5 billion came from. In 2009, they spent $13.8 billion. They brought in $6.1 billion in what they called revenues, including the bridges and tunnels. So the balance, which was 7.7, you and I paid for that in the form of 8 different taxes. Then in the fall of 09, they added the mobility tax, the payroll tax, for another $1.8 billion, giving you a total subsidy from you and I of $9.5 billion. So the question is, an authority is supposed to be, by definition, a public benefit corporation. So they start these authorities, give them all this power, and the theory is that the public will benefit from this corporation. Think anybody's getting, you and I getting benefits? What's wrong is that you and I don't work at the MTA. That's what's wrong with this discussion. So they're not a public benefit corporation. They're an employee benefit corporation. Well, the rest you could just sort of, take a look at on your own. I think things are going to get worse before they get better. Cuomo had a shot. He could have come down tough on the MTA. What he said was, no more new taxes. What does that mean? It means that existing taxes are going to stay. And we're all paying for it. And we pay for it with outrageous Long Island Railroad fees. We pay for it with the bridges and tunnels. And then we subsidize them all kinds of different ways, which is now 9 different taxes and subsidies. So there is a solution, but it's going to take time. So and I'd like to show you this little picture, this last one. It's kind of cute. It's your money being burned. Nobody burns taxpayer dollars better than the MTA. And at that, what I'd like to do is stop and answer any questions if anybody has questions. How many people were surprised at this information? I know I was when I put it together. So does anybody have a question? Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for listening. And I guess I'm all set. Right?